3. She goes out to battle against depression. A few days later, before the month of August had expired, Eustacia and Yeobright sat together at their early dinner. Eustacia's manner had become of late almost apathetic. There was a forlorn look about her beautiful eyes which, whether she deserved it or not, would have excited pity in the breast of anyone who had known her during the full flush of her love for Clym. The feelings of husband and wife varied in some measure, inversely with their positions. Clym, the afflicted man, was cheerful, and he even tried to comfort her, who had never felt a moment of physical suffering in her whole life. "Come, brighten up, dearest. We shall be all right again. Some day perhaps I shall see as well as ever. And I solemnly promise that I'll leave off cutting furs as soon as I have the power to do anything better. You cannot seriously wish me to stay idling at home all day." "But it is so dreadful. A furs cutter, and you a man who have lived about the world and speak French and German, and who are fit for what is so much better than this." "I suppose when you first saw me and heard about me, I was wrapped in a sort of golden halo to your eyes. A man who knew glorious things, and had mixed in brilliant scenes. In short, an adorable, delightful, distracting hero." "Yes," she said, sobbing. "And now I'm a poor fellow in brown leather." "Don't taunt me. But enough of this. I will not be depressed any more. I am going from home this afternoon, unless you greatly object. There is to be a village picnic, a gypsying they call it, at East Egdon, and I shall go." "To dance?" "Why not? You can sing." "Well, well, as you will. Must I come to fetch you?" "If you return soon enough from your work, but do not inconvenience yourself about it. I know the way home, and the heath has no terror for me." "And can you cling to gaiety so eagerly as to walk all the way to a village festival in search of it?" "No, you don't like my going alone. Clym, you are not jealous?" "No, but I would come with you, if it could give you any pleasure. Though as things stand, perhaps you have too much of me already. Still, I somehow wish that you did not want to go. Yes, perhaps I am jealous. And who could be jealous with more reason than I, a half-blind man, over such a woman as you? Don't think like it. Let me go, and don't take all my spirits away." "I would rather lose all my own, my sweet wife. Go, do whatever you like. Who can forbid your indulgence in any whim? You have all my heart yet, I believe, and because you bear with me, who am in truth a drag upon you, I owe you thanks. Yes, go alone and shine. As for me, I will stick to my doom. At that kind of meeting people would shun me. My hook and gloves are like the St. Lazarus rattle of the leper, warning the world to get out of the way of a sight that would sadden them." He kissed her, put on his leggings, and went out. When he was gone, she rested her head upon her hands, and said to herself, "2 wasted lives, his and mine, and I am come to this. Will it drive me out of my mind?" She cast about for any possible course which offered the least improvement on the existing state of things, and could find none. She imagined how all those Budmouth ones who should learn what had become of her would say, "Look at the girl for whom nobody was good enough." To Eustacia the situation seemed such a mockery of her hopes that death appeared the only door of relief, if the satire of heaven should go much further. Suddenly she aroused herself and exclaimed, "But I'll shake it off. Yes, I will shake it off. No one shall know my suffering. I'll be bitterly merry, and ironically gay, and I'll laugh in derision. And I'll begin by going to this dance on the green." She ascended to her bedroom and dressed herself with scrupulous care. To an onlooker, her beauty would have made her feelings almost seem reasonable. The gloomy corner into which accident as much as indiscretion had brought this woman might have led even a moderate partisan to feel that she had cogent reasons for asking the supreme power by what right a being of such exquisite finish had been placed in circumstances calculated to make of her charms a curse rather than a blessing. It was 5 in the afternoon when she came out from the house, ready for her walk. There was material enough in the picture for 20 new conquests. The rebellious sadness that was rather too apparent when she sat indoors without a bonnet was cloaked and softened by her outdoor attire, which always had a sort of nebulousness about it, devoid of harsh edges anywhere, so that her face looked from its environment as from a cloud, with no noticeable lines of demarcation between flesh and clothes. The heat of the day had scarcely declined as yet, and she went along the sunny hills at a leisurely pace, there being ample time for her idle expedition. Tall ferns buried her in their leafage whenever her path lay through them, which now formed miniature forests, though not one stem of them would remain to bud the next year. The site chosen for the village festivity was one of the lawn-like oases which were occasionally, yet not often, met with on the plateaus of the Heath district. The breaks of furze and fern terminated abruptly round the margin, and the grass was unbroken. A green cattle track skirted the spot, without, however, emerging from the screen of fern, and this path Eustacia followed in order to reconnoitre the group before joining it. The lusty notes of the East Egdon band had directed her unerringly, and she now beheld the musicians themselves, sitting in a blue wagon with red wheels, scrubbed as bright as new, and arched with sticks, to which boughs and flowers were tied. In front of this was the grand central dance of 15 or 20 couples, flanked by minor dances of inferior individuals whose gyrations were not always in strict keeping with the tune. The young men wore blue and white rosettes, and with a flush on their faces, footed it to the girls, who, with the excitement and the exercise, blushed deeper than the pink of their numerous ribbons. Fair ones with long curls, fair ones with short curls, fair ones with love-locks, fair ones with braids, flew round and round, and a beholder might well have wondered how such a prepossessing set of young women of like size, age, and disposition could have been collected together where there were only 1 or 2 villages to choose from. In the background was one happy man dancing by himself, with closed eyes, totally oblivious of all the rest. A fire was burning under a pollard thorn a few paces off, over which 3 kettles hung in a row. Hard by was a table, where elderly dames prepared tea, but Eustacia looked among them in vain for the cattle-dealer's wife, who had suggested that she should come, and had promised to obtain a courteous welcome for her. This unexpected absence of the only local resident whom Eustacia knew considerably damaged her scheme for an afternoon of reckless gaiety. Joining in became a matter of difficulty, notwithstanding that were she to advance, cheerful dames would come forward with cups of tea, and make much of her as a stranger of superior grace and knowledge to themselves. Having watched the company through the figures of 2 dances, she decided to walk a little farther, to a cottage where she might get some refreshment, and then return homeward in the shady time of evening. This she did, and by the time that she retraced her steps towards the scene of the gypsying, which it was necessary to repass on her way to Alderworth, the sun was going down. The air was now so still that she could hear the band afar off, and it seemed to be playing with more spirit, if that were possible, than when she had come away. On reaching the hill, the sun had quite disappeared, but this made little difference either to Eustacia or the revellers, for a round yellow moon was rising before her, though its rays had not yet outmastered those from the west. The dance was going on just the same, but strangers had arrived and formed a ring around the figure, so that Eustacia could stand among these without a chance of being recognized. A whole villageful of sensuous emotion, scattered abroad all the year long, surged here in a focus for an hour. The 40 hearts of those waving couples were beating as they had not done since 12 months before they had come together in similar jollity. For the time, paganism was revived in their hearts, the pride of life was all in all, and they adored none other than themselves. How many of those impassioned but temporary embraces were destined to become perpetual was possibly the wonder of some of those who indulged in them, as well as of Eustacia, who looked on. She began to envy those pirouetters, to hunger for the hope and happiness which the fascination of the dance seemed to engender within them. Desperately fond of dancing herself, one of Eustacia's expectations of Paris had been the opportunity it might afford her of indulgence in this favourite pastime. Unhappily, that expectation was now extinct within her forever. Whilst she abstractedly watched them, spinning, fluctuating in the increasing moonlight, she suddenly heard her name whispered by a voice over her shoulder. Turning in surprise, she beheld, at her elbow, one whose presence instantly caused her to flush to the temples. It was Wild Eve. Till this moment he had not met her eye since the morning of his marriage, when she had been loitering in the church and had startled him by lifting her veil and coming forward to sign the register as witness. Yet why the sight of him should have instigated that sudden rush of blood, she could not tell. Before she could speak, he whispered, "Do you like dancing as much as ever?" "I think I do," she replied in a low voice. "Will you dance with me?" "It would be a great change for me, but will it not seem strange?" "What strangeness can there be in relations dancing together?" "Ah, yes, relations. Perhaps none." "Still, if you don't like to be seen, pull down your veil. Though there's not much risk of being known by this light. Lots of strangers are here." She did as he suggested, and the act was a tacit acknowledgment that she accepted his offer. Wild Eve gave her his arm and took her down on the outside of the ring to the bottom of the dance, which they entered. In 2 minutes more they were involved in the figure and began working their way upwards to the top. Till they had advanced half-way thither, Eustacia wished more than once that she had not yielded to his request. From the middle to the top she felt that, since she had come out to seek pleasure, she was only doing a natural thing to obtain it. Fairly launched into the ceaseless glides and whirls which their new position as top couple opened up to them, Eustacia's pulses began to move too quickly for longer rumination of any kind. Through the length of 25 couples they threaded their giddy way, and a new vitality entered her form. The pale ray of evening lent a fascination to the experience. There is a certain degree and tone of light which tends to disturb the equilibrium of the senses and to promote dangerously the tenderer moods. Added to movement, it drives the emotions to rankness, the reason becoming sleepy and unperceiving in inverse proportion. And this light fell now upon these two, from the disk of the moon. All the dancing girls felt the symptoms, but Eustacia most of all. The grass under their feet became trodden away, and the hard, beaten surface of the sod, when viewed aslant towards the moonlight, shone like a polished table. The air became quite still. The flag above the wagon which held the musicians clung to the pole, and the players appeared only in outline against the sky, except when the circular mouths of the trombone, ophicleide, and French horn gleamed out like huge eyes from the shade of their figures. The pretty dresses of the maids lost their subtler day colors and showed more or less of a misty white. Eustacia floated round and round on Wild Eve's arm, her face rapt and statuesque. Her soul had passed away from and forgotten her features, which were left empty and quiescent, as they always are when feeling goes beyond their register. How near she was to Wild Eve! It was terrible to think of. She could feel his breathing, and he, of course, could feel hers. How badly she had treated him! Yet here they were, treading one measure. The enchantment of the dance surprised her. A clear line of difference divided like a tangible fence her experience within this maze of motion from her experience without it. Her beginning to dance had been like a change of atmosphere. Outside she had been steeped in arctic frigidity by comparison with the tropical sensations here. She had entered the dance from the troubled hours of her late life, as one might enter a brilliant chamber after a night walk in a wood. Wild Eve by himself would have been merely an agitation. Wild Eve added to the dance, and the moonlight, and the secrecy began to be a delight. Whether his personality supplied the greater part of this sweetly compounded feeling, or whether the dance and the scene weighed the more therein, was a nice point, upon which Eustacia herself was entirely in a cloud. People began to say, "Who are they?" But no invidious inquiries were made. Had Eustacia mingled with the other girls in their ordinary daily walks, the case would have been different. Here she was not inconvenienced by excessive inspection, for all were wrought to their brightest grace by the occasion. Like the planet Mercury, surrounded by the luster of sunset, her permanent brilliancy passed without much notice in the temporary glory of the situation. As for Wild Eve, his feelings are easy to guess. Obstacles were a ripening sun to his love, and he was at this moment in a delirium of exquisite misery. To clasp as his for 5 minutes what was another man's through all the rest of the year was a kind of thing he, of all men, could appreciate. He had long since begun to sigh again for Eustacia. Indeed, it may be asserted that signing the marriage register with Thomasin was the natural signal to his heart to return to its first quarters, and that the extra complication of Eustacia's marriage was the one addition required to make that return compulsory. Thus, for different reasons, what was to the rest an exhilarating movement was to these two a riding upon the whirlwind. The dance had come like an irresistible attack upon whatever sense of social order there was in their minds, to drive them back into old paths which were now doubly irregular. Through 3 dances in succession they spun their way, and then, fatigued with the incessant motion, Eustacia turned to quit the circle in which she had already remained too long. Wild Eve led her to a grassy mound a few yards distant, where she sat down, her partner standing beside her. From the time that he addressed her at the beginning of the dance till now, they had not exchanged a word. "The dance and the walking have tired you?" he said tenderly. "No, not greatly." "It is strange that we should have met here, of all places, after missing each other so long." "We have missed because we tried to miss, I suppose." "Yes, but you began that proceeding by breaking a promise." "It is scarcely worthwhile to talk of that now. We have formed other ties since then, you no less than I." "I am sorry to hear that your husband is ill." "He is not ill, only incapacitated." "Yes, that is what I mean. I sincerely sympathize with you in your trouble. Fate has treated you cruelly." She was silent a while. "Have you heard that he has chosen to work as a furs cutter?" she said, in a low, mournful voice. "It has been mentioned to me," answered Wild Eve hesitantly, "but I hardly believed it." "It is true. What do you think of me as a furs cutter's wife?" "I think the same as ever of you, Eustacia. Nothing of that sort can degrade you. You ennoble the occupation of your husband." "I wish I could feel it." "Is there any chance of Mr. Yeobright getting better?" "He thinks so." "I doubt it." "I was quite surprised to hear that he had taken a cottage. I thought, in common with other people, that he would have taken you off to a home in Paris immediately after you had married him. What a gay, bright future she has before her, I thought. He will, I suppose, return there with you, if his sight gets strong again." Observing that she did not reply, he regarded her more closely. She was almost weeping. Images of a future never to be enjoyed, the revived sense of her bitter disappointment, the picture of the neighbours' suspended ridicule, which was raised by Wild Eve's words, had been too much for proud Eustacia's equanimity. Wild Eve could hardly control his own too forward feelings when he saw her silent perturbation. But he affected not to notice this, and she soon recovered her calmness. "You do not intend to walk home by yourself?" he asked. "Oh, yes," said Eustacia. "What could hurt me on this heath, who have nothing? By diverging a little, I can make my way home the same as yours. I shall be glad to keep you company as far as Throop Corner." Seeing that Eustacia sat on in hesitation, he added, "Perhaps you think it unwise to be seen in the same road with me, after the events of last summer." "Indeed, I think no such thing," she said haughtily. "I shall accept whose company I choose, for all that may be said by the miserable inhabitants of Egdon." "Then let us walk on, if you are ready. Our nearest way is towards that holly bush with the dark shadow that you see down there." Eustacia arose and walked beside him in the direction signified, brushing her way over the damping heath and fern, and followed by the strains of the merrymakers who still kept up the dance. The moon had now waxed bright and silvery, but the heath was proof against such illumination, and there was to be observed the striking scene of a dark, rayless tract of country, under an atmosphere charged from its zenith to its extremities with whitest light. To an eye above them their two faces would have appeared amid the expanse, like two pearls on a table of ebony. On this account the irregularities of the path were not visible, and Wild Eve occasionally stumbled, whilst Eustacia found it necessary to perform some graceful feats of balancing whenever a small tuft of heather or root of furze protruded itself through the grass of the narrow track and entangled her feet. At these junctures in her progress a hand was invariably stretched forward to steady her, holding her firmly until smooth ground was again reached, when the hand was again withdrawn to a respectful distance. They performed the journey for the most part in silence, and drew near to Throop Corner, a few hundred yards from which a short path branched away to Eustacia's house. By degrees they discerned coming towards them a pair of human figures, apparently of the male sex. When they came a little nearer, Eustacia broke the silence by saying, "One of those men is my husband. He promised to come to meet me." "And the other is my greatest enemy," said Wild Eve. "It looks like Diggory Venn." "That is the man." "It is an awkward meeting," said she, "but such is my fortune. He knows too much about me, unless he could know more, and so prove to himself that what he now knows counts for nothing. Well, let it be. You must deliver me up to them." "You will think twice before you direct me to do that. Here is a man who has not forgotten an item in our meetings at Rainbarrow. He is in company with your husband. Which of them, seeing us together here, will believe that our meeting and dancing at the gypsy party was by chance?" "Very well," she whispered gloomily. "Leave me before they come up." Wild Eve bade her a tender farewell, and plunged across the fern and furze, Eustacia slowly walking on. In 2 or 3 minutes she met her husband and his companion. "My journey ends here for tonight, Redelman," said Yeobright as soon as he perceived her. "I turn back with this lady. Good night." "Good night, Mr. Yeobright," said Venn. "I hope to see you better soon." The moonlight shone directly upon Venn's face as he spoke, and revealed all its lines to Eustacia. He was looking suspiciously at her. That Venn's keen eye had discerned what Yeobright's feeble vision had not, a man in the act of withdrawing from Eustacia's side, was within the limits of the probable. If Eustacia had been able to follow the Redelman, she would soon have found striking confirmation of her thought. No sooner had Clym given her his arm and led her off the scene than the Redelman turned back from the beaten track towards East Egdon, whither he had been strolling merely to accompany Clym in his walk, Diggory's van being again in the neighbourhood. Stretching out his long legs, he crossed the pathless portion of the heath somewhat in the direction which Wild Eve had taken. Only a man accustomed to nocturnal rambles could, at this hour, have descended those shaggy slopes with Venn's velocity without falling headlong into a pit, or snapping off his leg by jamming his foot into some rabbit burrow. But Venn went on without much inconvenience to himself, and the course of his scamper was towards the Quiet Woman Inn. This place he reached in about half an hour, and he was well aware that no person who had been near Throop Corner when he started could have got down here before him. The lonely inn was not yet closed, though scarcely an individual was there, the business done being chiefly with travellers who passed the inn on long journeys, and these had now gone on their way. Venn went to the public room, called for a mug of ale, and inquired of the maid, in an indifferent tone, if Mr. Wild Eve was at home. Thomasin sat in an inner room and heard Venn's voice. When customers were present, she seldom showed herself, owing to her inherent dislike for the business, but perceiving that no one else was there tonight, she came out. "He's not at home yet, Diggory," she said pleasantly, "but I expected him sooner. He has been to East Egdon to buy a horse." "Did he wear a light wide-awake?" "Yes." Then I saw him at Throop Corner, leading one home," said Venn dryly. "A beauty with a white face, and a mane as black as night. He'll soon be here, no doubt." Rising and looking for a moment at the pure sweet face of Thomasin, over which a shadow of sadness had passed since the time when he had last seen her, he ventured to add, "Mr. Wildeve seems to be often away at this time." "Oh, yes," cried Thomasin, in what was intended to be a tone of gaiety. "Husbands will play the truant, you know. I wish you could tell me of some secret plan that would help me to keep him home at my will in the evenings." "I will consider if I know of one," replied Venn in that same light tone which meant no lightness. And then he bowed, in a manner of his own invention, and moved to go. Thomasin offered him her hand, and without a sigh, though with food for many, the Reddleman went out. When Wildeve returned a quarter of an hour later, Thomasin said simply, and in the abashed manner usual with her now, "Where is the horse, Damon?" "Oh, I have not bought it after all. The man asks too much." "But somebody saw you at Throop Corner leading it home, a beauty, with a white face, and a mane as black as night." "Ah!" said Wildeve, fixing his eyes upon her. "Who told you that?" "Venn, the Reddleman." The expression of Wildeve's face became curiously condensed. "That's a mistake. It must have been someone else," he said, slowly and testily, for he perceived that Venn's counter-moves had begun again. End of chapter 3. 4. Rough coercion is employed. Those words of Thomasin, which seemed so little but meant so much, remained in the ears of Diggory Venn. "Help me to keep him home in the evenings." On this occasion Venn had arrived on Egdon Heath only to cross to the other side. He had no further connection with the interests of the Yeobright family, and he had a business of his own to attend to. Yet he suddenly began to feel himself drifting into the old track of manoeuvring on Thomasin's account. He sat in his van and considered. From Thomasin's words and manner, he had plainly gathered that Wildeve neglected her. For whom could he neglect her, if not for Eustacia? Yet it was scarcely credible that things had come to such a head as to indicate that Eustacia systematically encouraged him. Venn resolved to reconnoitre somewhat carefully the lonely road which led along the vale from Wildeve's dwelling to Clim's house at Alderworth. At this time, as has been seen, Wildeve was quite innocent of any predetermined act of intrigue, and except at the dance on the green, he had not once met Eustacia since her marriage. But that the spirit of intrigue was in him had been shown by a recent romantic habit of his, a habit of going out after dark and strolling towards Alderworth, there looking at the moon and stars, looking at Eustacia's house, and walking back at leisure. Accordingly, when, watching on the night after the festival, the Reddleman saw him ascend by the little path, lean over the front gate of Clim's garden, sigh, and turn to go back again, it was plain that Wildeve's intrigue was rather ideal than real. Van retreated before him down the hill to a place where the path was merely a deep groove between the heather. Here he mysteriously bent over the ground for a few minutes, and retired. When Wild Eve came on to that spot, his ankle was caught by something, and he fell headlong. As soon as he had recovered the power of respiration, he sat up and listened. There was not a sound in the gloom beyond the spiritless stir of the summer wind. Feeling about for the obstacle which had flung him down, he discovered that 2 tufts of heath had been tied together across the path, forming a loop, which to a traveller was certain overthrow. Wild Eve pulled off the string that bound them, and went on with tolerable quickness. On reaching home, he found the cord to be of a reddish colour. 'Twas just what he had expected. Although his weaknesses were not specially those akin to physical fear, this species of coup de Jarnac, from one he knew too well, troubled the mind of Wild Eve. But his movements were unaltered thereby. A night or 2 later he again went along the vale to Alderworth, taking the precaution of keeping out of any path. The sense that he was watched, that craft was employed to circumvent his errant tastes, added piquancy to a journey so entirely sentimental, so long as the danger was of no fearful sort. He imagined that Van and Mrs. Yeobright were in league, and felt that there was a certain legitimacy in combating such a coalition. The heath tonight appeared to be totally deserted, and Wild Eve, after looking over Eustatia's garden gate for some little time, with a cigar in his mouth, was tempted by the fascination that emotional smuggling had for his nature, to advance towards the window, which was not quite closed, the blind being only partly drawn down. He could see into the room, and Eustacia was sitting there alone. Wild Eve contemplated her for a minute, and then, retreating into the heath, beat the ferns lightly, whereupon moths flew out alarmed. Securing one, he returned to the window, and holding the moth to the chink, opened his hand. The moth made towards the candle upon Eustatia's table, hovered round it 2 or 3 times, and flew into the flame. Eustacia started up. This had been a well-known signal in old times, when Wild Eve had used to come secretly wooing to Mistover. She at once knew that Wild Eve was outside, but before she could consider what to do, her husband came in from upstairs. Eustacia's face burnt crimson at the unexpected collision of incidents, and filled with an animation that it too frequently lacked. "You have a very high colour, dearest," said Yeobright, when he came close enough to see it. "Your appearance would be no worse if it were always so." "I am warm," said Eustacia. "I think I'll go into the air for a few minutes." "Shall I go with you?" "Oh, no, I'm only going to the gate." She arose, but before she had time to get out of the room, a loud rapping began upon the front door. I'll go," said Eustacia, in an unusually quick tone for her, and she glanced eagerly towards the window whence the moth had flown, but nothing appeared there. "You had better not at this time of the evening," he said. Clym stepped before her into the passage, and Eustacia waited, her somnolent manner covering her inner heat and agitation. She listened, and Clym opened the door. No words were uttered outside, and presently he closed it and came back, saying, "Nobody was there. I wonder what that could have meant." He was left to wonder during the rest of the evening, for no explanation offered itself, and Eustacia said nothing, the additional fact that she knew of only adding more mystery to the performance. Meanwhile, a little drama had been acted outside, which saved Eustacia from all possibility of compromising herself that evening at least. While Wildeve had been preparing his moth signal, another person had come up behind him, up to the gate. This man, who carried a gun in his hand, looked on for a moment at the other's operation by the window, walked up to the house, knocked at the door, and then vanished round the corner and over the hedge. "Damn him," said Wildeve. "He's been watching me again." As his signal had been rendered futile by this uproarious rapping, Wildeve withdrew, passed out at the gate, and walked quickly down the path, without thinking of anything except getting away unnoticed. Halfway down the hill the path ran near a knot of stunted hollies, which, in the general darkness of the scene, stood as the pupil in a black eye. When Wildeve reached this point, a report startled his ear, and a few spent gunshots fell among the leaves around him. There was no doubt that he himself was the cause of that gun's discharge, and he rushed into the clump of hollies, beating the bushes furiously with his stick, but nobody was there. This attack was a more serious matter than the last, and it was some time before Wildeve recovered his equanimity. A new and most unpleasant system of menace had begun, and the intent appeared to be to do him grievous bodily harm. Wildeve had looked upon Ven's first attempt as a species of horseplay, which the Reddleman had indulged in for want of knowing better, but now the boundary line was passed, which divides the annoying from the perilous. Had Wildeve known how thoroughly in earnest Ven had become, he might have been still more alarmed. The Reddleman had been almost exasperated by the sight of Wildeve outside Clim's house, and he was prepared to go to any lengths, short of absolutely shooting him, to terrify the young innkeeper out of his recalcitrant impulses. The doubtful legitimacy of such rough coercion did not disturb the mind of Ven. It troubles few such minds in such cases, and sometimes this is not to be regretted. From the impeachment of Strafford to Farmer Lynch's short way with the scamps of Virginia, there have been many triumphs of justice, which are mockeries of law. About half a mile below Clim's secluded dwelling lay a hamlet where lived one of the two constables who preserved the peace in the parish of Alderworth, and Wildeve went straight to the constable's cottage. Almost the first thing that he saw on opening the door was the constable's truncheon hanging to a nail, as if to assure him that here were the means to his purpose. On inquiry, however, of the constable's wife, he learned that the constable was not at home. Wildeve said he would wait. The minutes ticked on, and the constable did not arrive. Wildeve cooled down from his state of high indignation to a restless dissatisfaction with himself, the scene, the constable's wife, and the whole set of circumstances. He arose and left the house. Altogether, the experience of that evening had had a cooling, not to say a chilling, effect on misdirected tenderness, and Wildeve was in no mood to ramble again to Alderworth after nightfall in hope of a stray glance from Eustacia. Thus far the Reddleman had been tolerably successful in his rude contrivances for keeping down Wildeve's inclination to rove in the evening. He had nipped in the bud the possible meeting between Eustacia and her old lover this very night, but he had not anticipated that the tendency of his action would be to divert Wildeve's movement rather than to stop it. The gambling with the guineas had not conduced to make him a welcome guest to Clim, but To call upon his wife's relative was natural, and he was determined to see Eustacia. It was necessary to choose some less untoward hour than 10 o'clock at night. "Since it is unsafe to go in the evening," he said, "I'll go by day." Meanwhile Venn had left the heath and gone to call upon Mrs. Yeobright, with whom he had been on friendly terms since she had learned what a providential countermove he had made towards the restitution of the family guineas. She wondered at the lateness of his call, but had no objection to see him. He gave her a full account of Clim's affliction and of the state in which he was living. Then, referring to Thomasin, touched gently upon the apparent sadness of her days. "Now, ma'am, depend upon it," he said, "you couldn't do a better thing for either of them than to make yourself at home in their houses, even if there should be a little rebuff at first." "Both she and my son disobeyed me in marrying. Therefore I have no interest in their households. Their troubles are of their own making." Mrs. Yeobright tried to speak severely, but the account of her son's state had moved her more than she cared to show. "Your visits would make Wildeve walk straighter than he is inclined to do, and might prevent unhappiness down the heath." "What do you mean?" "I saw something tonight out there which I didn't like at all. I wish your son's house and Mr. Wildeve's were 100 miles apart, instead of 4 or 5. "Then there was an understanding between him and Clim's wife when he made a fool of Thomasin." "Well, we'll hope there's no understanding now." "And our hope will very probably be very vain. Oh, Clim, oh, Thomasin!" "There's no harm done yet. In fact, I've persuaded Wildeve to mind his own business." "How?" "Oh, not by talking. By a plan of mine called the silent system." "I hope you'll succeed." "I shall, if you help me by calling and making friends with your son. You'll have a chance then of using your eyes." "Well, since it has come to this," said Mrs. Yeobright sadly, "I will own to you, Riddleman, that I thought of going. I should be much happier if we were reconciled. The marriage is unalterable, my life may be cut short, and I should wish to die in peace. He is my only son, and since sons are made of such stuff, I am not sorry I have no other. As for Thomasin, I never expected much from her, and she has not disappointed me. But I forgave her long ago, and I forgive him now. I'll go." At this very time of the Reddleman's conversation with Mrs. Yeobright at Bloom's End, another conversation on the same subject was languidly proceeding at Alderworth. All the day Clim had borne himself as if his mind were too full of its own matter to allow him to care about outward things, and his words now showed what had occupied his thoughts. It was just after the mysterious knocking that he began the theme. "Since I've been away today, Eustacia, I've considered that something must be done to heal up this ghastly breach between my dear mother and myself. It troubles me." What do you propose to do?" said Eustacia, abstractedly, for she could not clear away from her the excitement caused by Wildeve's recent manoeuvre for an interview. "You seem to take a very mild interest in what I propose, little or much," said Clim, with tolerable warmth. "Oh, you mistake me," she answered, reviving at his reproach. "I'm only thinking." "What of?" "Partly of that moth whose skeleton is getting burnt up in the wick of the candle," she said slowly. "But you know I always take an interest in what you say." "Very well, dear. Then I think I must go and call upon her," he went on with tender feeling. "It is a thing I'm not at all too proud to do, and only a fear that I might irritate her has kept me away so long. But I must do something. It is wrong in me to allow this sort of thing to go on." "What have you to blame yourself about? She's getting old, and her life is lonely, and I am her only son." "She has Thomasin." "Thomasin is not her daughter, and if she were, that would not excuse me. But this is beside the point. I've made up my mind to go to her, and all I wish to ask you is whether you will do your best to help me. That is, forget the past. And if she shows her willingness to be reconciled, meet her halfway by welcoming her to our house, or by accepting a welcome to hers." At first, Eustacia closed her lips as if she would rather do anything on the whole globe than what he suggested. But the lines of her mouth softened with thought, though not so far as they might have softened, and she said, "I will put nothing in your way, but after what has passed, it is asking too much that I go and make advances." "You never distinctly told me what did pass between you." "I could not do it then, nor can I now. Sometimes more bitterness is sown in 5 minutes than can be got rid of in a whole life, and that may be the case here." She paused a few moments and added, "Oh, if you had never returned to your native place, Clem, what a blessing it would have been for you! It has altered the destinies of 3 people. 5, Eustacia thought, but she kept that in. End of chapter 4. Book 4. The Closed Door. 5. The Journey Across the Heath. Thursday, the 31st of August, was one of a series of days during which snug houses were stifling, and when cool draughts were treats, when cracks appeared in clayey gardens and were called earthquakes by apprehensive children, when loose spokes were discovered in the wheels of carts and carriages, and when stinging insects haunted the air, the earth, and every drop of water that was to be found. In Mrs. Yeobright's garden, large-leaved plants of a tender kind flagged by 10 o'clock in the morning, rhubarb bent downward at 11, and even stiff cabbages were limp by noon. 'Twas about 11 o'clock on this day that Mrs. Yeobright started across the heath towards her son's house, to do her best in getting reconciled with him and Eustacia, in conformity with her words to the Reddleman. She had hoped to be well advanced in her walk before the heat of the day was at its highest, but after setting out she found that this was not to be done. The sun had branded the whole heath with his mark, even the purple heath flowers having put on a brownness under the dry blazes of the few preceding days. Every valley was filled with air like that of a kiln, and clean quartz sand of the winter watercourses which formed summer paths had undergone a species of incineration since the drought had set in. In cool, fresh weather Mrs. Yeobright would have found no inconvenience in walking to Alderworth, but the present torrid attack made the journey a heavy undertaking for a woman past middle age, and at the end of the 3rd mile she wished that she had hired Fairway to drive her a portion at least of the distance. But from the point at which she had arrived it was as easy to reach Clem's house as to get home again. So she went on, the air around her pulsating silently, and oppressing the earth with lassitude. She looked at the sky overhead, and saw that the sapphirine hue of the zenith in spring and early summer had been replaced by a metallic violet.
Occasionally she came to a spot where independent worlds of ephemerans were passing their time in mad carousal, some in the air, some on the hot ground and vegetation, some in the tepid and stringy water of a nearly dried pool. All the shallower ponds had decreased to a vaporous mud, amid which the maggoty shapes of innumerable obscure creatures could be indistinctly seen, heaving and wallowing with enjoyment. Being a woman not disinclined to philosophize, she sometimes sat down under her umbrella to rest and to watch their happiness, for a certain hopefulness as to the result of her visit gave ease to her mind, and between important thoughts left it free to dwell on any infinitesimal matter which caught her eyes. Mrs. Yeobright had never before been to her son's house, and its exact position was unknown to her. She tried one ascending path and another, and found that they led her astray. Retracing her steps, she came again to an open level, where she perceived at a distance a man at work. She went towards him and inquired the way. The labourer pointed out the direction, and added, "D'ye see that furze cutter, ma'am, going up that footpath yond?" Mrs. Yeobright strained her eyes, and at last said that she did perceive him. "Well, if you follow him, you can make no mistake. He's going to the same place, ma'am." She followed the figure indicated. He appeared of a russet hue, not more distinguishable from the scene around him than the green caterpillar from the leaf it feeds on. His progress when actually walking was more rapid than Mrs. Yeobright's, but she was enabled to keep at an equable distance from him by his habit of stopping whenever he came to a break of brambles, where he paused a while. On coming in her turn to each of these spots, she found half a dozen long limp brambles which he had cut from the bush during his halt, and laid out straight beside the path. They were evidently intended for furze faggot bonds, which he meant to collect on his return. The silent being who thus occupied himself seemed to be of no more account in life than an insect. He appeared as a mere parasite of the heath, fretting its surface in his daily labour, as a moth frets a garment, entirely engrossed with its products, having no knowledge of anything in the world but fern, furze, heath, lichens, and moss. The furze cutter was so absorbed in the business of his journey that he never turned his head, and his leather-legged and gauntleted form at length became to her as nothing more than a moving hand-post to show her the way. Suddenly she was attracted to his individuality by observing peculiarities in his walk. It was a gait she had seen somewhere before, and the gait revealed the man to her, as the gait of Ahimaaz in the distant plain made him known to the watchman of the king. "His walk is exactly as my husband's used to be," she said, and then the thought burst upon her that the furze cutter was her son. She was scarcely able to familiarize herself with this strange reality. She had been told that Clem was in the habit of cutting furs, but she had supposed that he occupied himself with the labor only at odd times by way of useful pastime. Yet she now beheld him as a furze cutter and nothing more, wearing the regulation dress of the craft, and thinking the regulation thoughts, to judge by his motions. Planning a dozen hasty schemes for at once preserving him and Eustacia from this mode of life, she throbbingly followed the way, and saw him enter his own door. At one side of Clem's house was a knoll, and on the top of the knoll a clump of fir-trees, so highly thrust up into the sky that their foliage from a distance appeared as a black spot in the air above the crown of the hill. On reaching this place, Mrs. Yeobright felt distressingly agitated, weary, and unwell. She ascended, and sat down under their shade to recover herself, and to consider how best to break the ground with Eustacia, so as not to irritate a woman underneath whose apparent indolence lurked passions even stronger and more active than her own. The trees beneath which she sat were singularly battered, rude, and wild, and for a few minutes Mrs. Yeobright dismissed thoughts of her own storm-broken and exhausted state to contemplate theirs. Not a bough in the 9 trees which composed the group but was splintered, lopped, and distorted by the fierce weather that there held them at its mercy whenever it prevailed. Some were blasted and split as if by lightning, black stains as from fire marking their sides, while the ground at their feet was strewn with dead fir needles and heaps of cones, blown down in the gales of past years. The place was called the Devil's Bellows, and it was only necessary to come there on a March or November night to discover the forcible reasons for that name. On the present heated afternoon, when no perceptible wind was blowing, the trees kept up a perpetual moan, which one could hardly believe to be caused by the air. Here she sat for 20 minutes or more, ere she could summon resolution to go down to the door, her courage being lowered to 0 by her physical lassitude. To any other person than a mother, it might have seemed a little humiliating that she, the elder of the 2 women, should be the first to make advances. But Mrs. Yeobright had well considered all that, and she only thought how best to make her visit appear to Eustacia not abject, but wise. From her elevated position the exhausted woman could perceive the roof of the house below, and the garden, and the whole enclosure of the little domicile. And now, at the moment of rising, she saw a second man approaching the gate. His manner was peculiar, hesitating, and not that of a person come on business or by invitation. He surveyed the house with interest, and then walked round and scanned the outer boundary of the garden, as one might have done had it been the birthplace of Shakespeare, the prison of Mary Stuart, or the chateau of Hougoumont. After passing round and again reaching the gate, he went in. Mrs. Yeobright was vexed at this, having reckoned on finding her son and wife by themselves. But a moment's thought showed her that the presence of an acquaintance would take off the awkwardness of her first appearance in the house, by confining the talk to general matters until she had begun to feel comfortable with them. She came down the hill to the gate, and looked into the hot garden. There lay the cat, asleep on the bare gravel of the path, as if beds, rugs, and carpets were unendurable. The leaves of the hollyhocks hung like half-closed umbrellas, the sap almost simmered in the stems, and foliage with a smooth surface glared like metallic mirrors. A small apple tree of the sort called rather ripe grew just inside the gate, the only one which throve in the garden by reason of the lightness of the soil, and among the fallen apples on the ground beneath were wasps rolling drunk with the juice, or creeping about the little caves in each fruit which they had eaten out before stupefied by its sweetness. By the door lay Clim's furze hook, and the last handful of faggot bonds she had seen him gather. They had, plainly, been thrown down there as he entered the house. End of chapter 5. 6. A conjuncture, and its result upon the pedestrian. Wild Eve, as has been stated, was determined to visit Eustacia boldly by day, and on the easy terms of a relation, since the Reddleman had spied out and spoiled his walks to her by night. The spell that she had thrown over him in the moonlight dance made it impossible for a man having no strong puritanic force within him to keep away altogether. He merely calculated on meeting her and her husband in an ordinary manner, chatting a little while, and leaving again. Every outward sign was to be conventional, but the one great fact would be there to satisfy him. He would see her. He did not even desire Clem's absence, since it was just possible that Eustacia might resent any situation which could compromise her dignity as a wife, whatever the state of her heart towards him. Women were often so. He went accordingly, and it happened that the time of his arrival coincided with that of Mrs. Yeobright's pause on the hill near the house. When he had looked round the premises in the manner she had noticed, he went and knocked at the door. There was a few minutes' interval, and then the key turned in the lock, the door opened, and Eustacia herself confronted him. Nobody could have imagined from her bearing now that here stood the woman who had joined with him in the impassioned dance of the week before, unless, indeed, he could have penetrated below the surface and gauged the real depth of that still stream. "I hope you reached home safely?" said Wild Eve. "Oh, yes," she carelessly returned. "And were you not tired the next day? I feared you might be." "I was, rather. You need not speak low, nobody will overhear us. My small servant is gone on an errand to the village." "Then Clem is not at home?" "Yes, he is." "Oh, I thought that perhaps you had locked the door because you were alone and were afraid of tramps." "No, here is my husband." They had been standing in the entry. Closing the front door and turning the key as before, she threw open the door of the adjoining room, and asked him to walk in. Wild Eve entered, the room appearing to be empty. But as soon as he had advanced a few steps, he started. On the hearthrug lay Clem, asleep. Beside him were the leggings, thick boots, leather gloves, and sleeve waistcoat in which he worked. "You may go in, you will not disturb him," she said, following behind. "My reason for fastening the door is that he may not be intruded upon by any chance comer while lying here, if I should be in the garden or upstairs." "Why is he sleeping there?" said Wild Eve in low tones. "He is very weary. He went out at 4:30 this morning, and has been working ever since. He cuts furs because it's the only thing he can do that does not put any strain upon his poor eyes." The contrast between the sleeper's appearance and Wild Eve's at this moment was painfully apparent to Eustacia, Wild Eve being elegantly dressed in a new summer suit and light hat, and she continued, "Ah, you don't know how differently he appeared when I first met him, though it is such a little while ago. His hands were as white and soft as mine, and look at them now, how rough and brown they are. His complexion is by nature fair, and that rusty look he has now, all of a colour with his leather clothes, is caused by the burning of the sun." "Why does he go out at all?" Wild Eve whispered. "Because he hates to be idle. Though what he earns doesn't add much to our exchequer, however, he says that when people are living upon their capital, they must keep down current expenses by turning a penny where they can." "The fates have not been kind to you, Eustacia Yeobright." "I have nothing to thank them for." "Nor has he, except for their one great gift to him." "What's that?" Wild Eve looked her in the eyes. Eustacia blushed for the first time that day. "Well, I am a questionable gift," she said quietly. "I thought you meant the gift of content, which he has, and I have not."
I can understand content in such a case, though how the outward situation can attract him puzzles me.
That's because you don't know him. He's an enthusiast about ideas, careless about outward things. He often reminds me of the Apostle Paul.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that he's so grand in character as that.
Yes, but the worst of it is that though Paul was excellent as a man in the Bible, he would hardly have done in real life.
Their voices had instinctively dropped lower, though at first they had taken no particular care to avoid awakening Clym.
Well, if that means that your marriage is a misfortune to you, you know who is to blame, said Wild Eve.
The marriage is no misfortune in itself, she retorted with some little petulance. It's simply the accident which has happened since that has been the cause of my ruin.
I've certainly got thistles for figs in a worldly sense, but how could I tell what time would bring forth?
Sometimes, Eustacia, I think it's a judgment upon you. You rightly belong to me, you know, and I had no idea of losing you.
No, it was not my fault. Two could not belong to you. And remember that before I was aware, you turned aside to another woman. It was cruel levity in you to do that. I never dreamt of playing such a game on my side, till you began it on yours.
I meant nothing by it, replied Wild Eve. It was a mere interlude. Men are given to the trick of having a passing fancy for somebody else in the midst of a permanent love, which reasserts itself afterwards just as before. On account of your rebellious manner to me, I was tempted to go further than I should have done, and when you still would keep playing the same tantalizing part, I went further still and married her. Turning and looking again at the unconscious form of Clym, he murmured, I'm afraid you don't value your prize, Clym. He ought to be happier than I in one thing at least. He may know what it is to come down in the world, and to be afflicted with a great personal calamity, but he probably doesn't know what it is to lose the woman he loved.
He is not ungrateful for winning her, whispered Eustacia, and in that respect he is a good man. Many women would go far for such a husband. But do I desire unreasonably much in wanting what is called life? Music, poetry, passion, war, and all the beating and pulsing that's going on in the great arteries of the world. That was the shape of my youthful dream, but I did not get it. Yet I thought I saw the way to it in my Clym.
And you only married him on that account?
There you mistake me. I married him because I loved him. But I won't say that I didn't love him partly because I thought I saw a promise of that life in him.
You have dropped into your old mournful key.
But I'm not going to be depressed, she cried perversely. I began a new system by going to that dance, and I mean to stick to it. Clym can sing merrily, why should not I?
Wild Eve looked thoughtfully at her. It's easier to say you will sing than to do it, though if I could, I would encourage you in your attempt. But as life means nothing to me without one thing which is now impossible, you'll forgive me for not being able to encourage you.
Damon, what is the matter with you that you speak like that?
She asked, raising her deep, shady eyes to his. That's a thing I shall never tell plainly, and perhaps if I try to tell you in riddles, you will not care to guess them.
Eustacia remained silent for a minute, and she said, We're in a strange relationship today. You mince matters to an uncommon nicety. You mean, Damon, that you still love me. Well, that gives me sorrow. For I am not made so entirely happy by my marriage that I am willing to spurn you for the information, as I ought to do.
But we've said too much about this.
Do you mean to wait until my husband is awake?
I thought to speak to him, but it's unnecessary. Eustacia, If I offend you by not forgetting you, you are right to mention it. But do not talk of spurning." She did not reply, and they stood looking musingly at Clym, as he slept on in that profound sleep which is the result of physical labour carried on in circumstances that wake no nervous fear. "God, how I envy him that sweet sleep," said Wild Eve. "I've not slept like that since I was a boy, years and years ago." While they thus watched him, a click at the gate was audible, and a knock came to the door. Eustacia went to a window and looked out. Her countenance changed. First she became crimson, and then the red subsided, till it even partially left her lips. "Shall I go away?" said Wild Eve, standing up. "I hardly know." "Who is it?" "Mrs. Yeobright. Oh, what she said to me that day! I cannot understand this visit. What does she mean? And she suspects that past time of ours." "I'm in your hands. If you think she had better not see me here, I'll go into the next room." "Well, yes, go." Wild Eve at once withdrew. But before he had been half a minute in the adjoining apartment, Eustacia came after him. "No," she said, "we won't have any of this. If she comes in, she must see you, and think, if she likes, there's something wrong. But how can I open the door to her when she dislikes me, wishes to see not me, but her son? I won't open the door." Mrs. Yeobright knocked again, more loudly. "Her knocking will in all likelihood awaken him," continued Eustacia, "and then he will let her in himself. Ah, listen." They could hear Clym moving in the other room, as if disturbed by the knocking, and he uttered the word, "Mother." "Yes, he is awake. He will go to the door," she said, with a breath of relief. "Come this way. I have a bad name with her, and you must not be seen. Thus I am obliged to act by stealth, not because I do ill, but because others are pleased to say so." By this time she had taken him to the back door, which was open, disclosing a path leading down the garden. "Now, one word, Damon," she remarked as he stepped forth. "This is your first visit here. Let it be your last. We have been hot lovers in our time, but it won't do now. Good-bye." "Good-bye," said Wild Eve. "I've had all I came for, and I am satisfied." "What was it?" "A sight of you. Upon my eternal honour, I came for no more." Wild Eve kissed his hand to the beautiful girl he addressed, and passed into the garden, where she watched him down the path, over the stile at the end, and into the ferns outside, which brushed his hips as he went along, till he became lost in their thickets. When he had quite gone, she slowly turned, and directed her attention to the interior of the house. But it was possible that her presence might not be desired by Clym and his mother at this moment of their first meeting, or that it would be superfluous. At all events, she was in no hurry to meet Mrs. Yeobright. She resolved to wait till Clym came to look for her, and glided back into the garden. Here she idly occupied herself for a few minutes, till, finding no notice was taken of her, she retraced her steps through the house to the front, where she listened for voices in the parlour. But hearing none, she opened the door and went in. To her astonishment, Clym lay precisely as Wild Eve and herself had left him, his sleep apparently unbroken. He had been disturbed and made to dream and murmur by the knocking, but he had not awakened. Eustacia hastened to the door, and in spite of her reluctance to open it to a woman who had spoken of her so bitterly, she unfastened it and looked out. Nobody was to be seen. There by the scraper lay Clym's hook and the handful of faggot bonds he had brought home.
In front of her were the empty path, the garden gate standing slightly ajar, and beyond, the great valley of purple heath, thrilling silently in the sun. Mrs. Yeobright was gone. Clym's mother was, at this time, following a path which lay hidden from Eustacia by a shoulder of the hill. Her walk thither from the garden gate had been hasty and determined, as of a woman who was now no less anxious to escape from the scene than she had previously been to enter it. Her eyes were fixed on the ground. Within her 2 sights were graven, that of Clym's hook and brambles at the door, and that of a woman's face at a window. Her lips trembled, becoming unnaturally thin, as she murmured, "Oh, 'tis too much! Clym, how can he bear to do it? He is at home, and yet he lets her shut the door against me." In her anxiety to get out of the direct view of the house, she had diverged from the straightest path homeward, and while looking about to regain it, she came upon a little boy gathering whortleberries in a hollow. The boy was Johnny Nonsuch, who had been Eustacia's stoker at the bonfire, and with the tendency of a minute body to gravitate towards a greater, he began hovering round Mrs. Yeobright as soon as she appeared, and trotted on beside her, without perceptible consciousness of his act. Mrs. Yeobright spoke to him, as one in a mesmeric sleep. "'Tis a long way home, my child, and we shall not get there till evening." "I shall," said her small companion. "I'm going to play marnels afore supper, and we go to supper at 6 o'clock, because father comes home. Does your father come home at 6 too?" "No, he never comes, nor my son neither, nor anybody." "What have made you so down? Have you seen a oozer?" "I have seen what's worse, a woman's face looking at me through a window pane." "Is that a bad sight?" "Yes, it is always a bad sight to see a woman looking out at a weary wayfarer and not letting her in." "Once when I went to Throop Great Pond to catch efforts, I seed myself looking up at myself, and I was frightened and jumped back like anything." "Oh, if they'd only shown signs of meeting my advances halfway, how well it might have been done. But there's no chance. Shut out. She must have set him against me. Can there be beautiful bodies without hearts inside? I think so. I would not have done it against a neighbour's cat on such a fiery day as this." "What is it you say?" "Never again, never, not even if they send for me." "You must be a very curious woman to talk like that." "Oh, no, not at all," she said, returning to the boy's prattle. "Most people who grow up and have children talk as I do. When you grow up, your mother will talk as I do, too." "Oh, I hope she won't, because 'tis very bad to talk nonsense." "Yes, child, it is nonsense, I suppose. Are you not nearly spent with the heat?" "Yes, but not so much as you be." "How do you know?" "Your face is white and wet, and your head is hanging down like." "Oh, I'm exhausted from inside." "Why do you, every time you take a step, go like this?" The child, in speaking, gave to his motion the jerk and limp of an invalid. "Because I have a burden which is more than I can bear." The little boy remained silently pondering, and they tottered on side by side until more than a quarter of an hour had elapsed, when Mrs. Yeobright, whose weakness plainly increased, said to him, "I must sit down here to rest." When she had seated herself, he looked long in her face and said, "How funny you draw your breath, like a lamb when you drive him till he's nearly done for. Do you always draw your breath like that?"
"Not always."
Her voice was now so low as to be scarcely above a whisper. "You'll go to sleep there, I suppose, won't you? You've shut your eyes already."
"No, I shall not sleep much till another day, and then I hope to have a long, long one, very long. Now can you tell me if Rimsmore Pond is dry this summer?"
"Rimsmore Pond is, but Ochre's Pool isn't, because he's deep and is never dry. 'Tis just over there."
"Is the water clear?"
"Oh, yes, middling, 'cept where the heath croppers walk into it."
"Then take this and go as fast as you can and dip me up the clearest you can find. I am very faint."
She drew from the small willow reticule that she carried in her hand an old-fashioned china teacup without a handle. It was one of half a dozen of the same sort lying in the reticule, which she had preserved ever since her childhood, and had brought with her to-day as a small present for Clym and Eustacia. The boy started on his errand and soon came back with the water, such as it was. Mrs. Yeobright attempted to drink, but it was so warm as to give her nausea, and she threw it away. Afterwards she still remained sitting, with her eyes closed. The boy waited, played near her, caught several of the little brown butterflies which abounded, and then said as he waited again, "I like going on better than biding still. Will you soon start again?"
"I don't know."
"I wish I might go on by myself," he resumed, fearing apparently that he was to be pressed into some unpleasant service. "Do you want me any more, please?" Mrs. Yeobright made no reply. "What shall I tell mother?" the boy continued.
"Tell her you've seen a broken-hearted woman cast off by her son." Before quite leaving her, he threw upon her face a wistful glance, as if he had misgivings on the generosity of forsaking her thus. He gazed into her face in a vague, wondering manner, like that of one examining some strange old manuscript, the key to whose characters is undiscoverable. He was not so young as to be absolutely without a sense that sympathy was demanded. He was not old enough to be free from the terror felt in childhood at beholding misery in adult quarters hitherto deemed impregnable. And whether she were in a position to cause trouble or to suffer from it, whether she and her affliction were something to pity or something to fear, it was beyond him to decide. He lowered his eyes and went on without another word. Before he had gone half a mile he had forgotten all about her, except that she was a woman who had sat down to rest. Mrs. Yeobright's exertions, physical and emotional, had well-nigh prostrated her, but she continued to creep along in short stages, with long breaks between. The sun had now got far to the west of south, and stood directly in her face, like some merciless incendiary, brand in hand, waiting to consume her. With the departure of the boy, all visible animation disappeared from the landscape, though the intermittent husky notes of the male grasshoppers from every tuft of furze were enough to show that amid the prostration of the larger animal species an unseen insect world was busy in all the fullness of life. In 2 hours she reached the slope about 3/4 the whole distance from Alderworth to her own home, where a little patch of shepherd's thyme intruded upon the path, and she sat down upon the perfumed mat it formed there. In front of her a colony of ants had established a thoroughfare across the way, where they toiled, a never-ending and heavy-laden throng. To look down upon them was like observing a city street from the top of a tower. She remembered that this bustle of ants had been in progress for years at the same spot. Doubtless those of the old times were the ancestors of these which walked there now.
She leant back to obtain more thorough rest, and the soft eastern portion of the sky was as great a relief to her eyes as the time was to her head. While she looked, a heron arose on that side of the sky, and flew on with his face towards the sun. He had come dripping wet from some pool in the valleys, and as he flew, the edges and lining of his wings, his thighs, and his breast were so caught by the bright sunbeams that he appeared as if formed of burnished silver. Up in the zenith, where he was, seemed a free and happy place, away from all contact with the earthly ball to which she was pinioned, and she wished that she could arise uncrushed from its surface and fly as he flew then. But, being a mother, it was inevitable that she should soon cease to ruminate upon her own condition. Had the track of her next thought been marked by a streak in the air like the path of a meteor, it would have shown a direction contrary to the heron's, and have descended to the eastward, upon the roof of Klim's house. End of Chapter 6. Book 4. The Closed Door. 7. The Tragic Meeting of Two Old Friends. He, in the meantime, had aroused himself from sleep, sat up, and looked around. Eustacia was sitting in a chair hard by him, and though she held a book in her hand, she had not looked into it for some time. "Oh, well, indeed," said Klim, brushing his eyes with his hands. "How soundly I slept! I've had such a tremendous dream, too, one I shall never forget." "I thought you had been dreaming," said she. "Yes, it was about my mother. I dreamt that I took you to her house to make up differences, and when we got there we couldn't get in, though she kept on crying to us for help. However, dreams are dreams. What o'clock is it, Eustacia?" 2:30. "So late, is it? I didn't mean to stay so long. By the time I've had something to eat it will be after 3. Anne is not come back from the village, and I thought I would let you sleep on till she returned." Klim went to the window and looked out. Presently he said musingly, "Week after week passes, and yet Mother does not come. I thought I should have heard something from her long before this." Misgiving, regret, fear, resolution ran their swift course of expression in Eustacia's dark eyes. She was face to face with a monstrous difficulty, and she resolved to get free of it by postponement. "I must certainly go to Bloom's End soon," he continued, "and I think I'd better go alone." He picked up his leggings and gloves, threw them down again, and added, "As dinner will be so late today, I will not go back to the heath but work in the garden till the evening, and then, when it will be cooler, I will walk to Bloom's End. I'm quite sure that if I make a little advance, Mother will be willing to forget all. It'll be rather late before I can get home, as I shall not be able to do the distance either way in less than an hour and a half. But you will not mind for one evening, dear? What are you thinking of to make you look so abstracted?" "I cannot tell you," she said heavily. "Oh, I wish we didn't live here, Klim. The world seems all wrong in this place." "Well, if we make it so. I wonder if Thompson's been to Bloom's End lately. I hope so, but probably not, as she is, I believe, expecting to be confined in a month or 2. I wish I'd thought of that before. Poor Mother must indeed be very lonely." "I don't like you going tonight." "Why not tonight?" "Something may be said which will terribly injure me." "My mother is not vindictive," said Clym, his colour faintly rising. "But I wish you would not go," Eustacia repeated, in a low tone. "If you agree not to go tonight, I promise to go by myself to her house tomorrow and make it up with her, and wait till you fetch me." "Why do you want to do that at this particular time, when at every previous time that I've proposed it you have refused?" "I cannot explain further than that I should like to see her alone before you go," she answered, with an impatient move of her head, and looking at him with an anxiety more frequently seen upon those of a sanguine temperament than upon such as herself. "Well, it's very odd that just when I had decided to go myself, you should want to do what I proposed long ago. If I wait for you to go tomorrow, another day will be lost, and I know I shall be unable to rest another night without having been. I want to get this settled, and will. You must visit her afterwards. It will be all the same." "I could even go with you now." "You could scarcely walk there and back without a longer rest than I shall take. No, not tonight, Eustacia." "Let it be as you say, then," she replied, in the quiet way of one who, though willing to ward off evil consequences by a mild effort, would let events fall out as they might, sooner than wrestle hard to direct them. Clym then went into the garden, and a thoughtful languor stole over Eustacia for the remainder of the afternoon, which her husband attributed to the heat of the weather. In the evening he set out on the journey. Although the heat of summer was yet intense, the days had considerably shortened, and before he had advanced a mile on his way, all the heath purples, browns, and greens had merged in a uniform dress without airiness or gradation, and broken only by touches of white, where the little heaps of clean quartz sand showed the entrance to a rabbit burrow, or where the white flints of a footpath lay like a thread over the slopes. In almost every one of the isolated and stunted thorns which grew here and there, a nighthawk revealed his presence, by whirring like the clack of a mill as long as he could hold his breath, then stopping, flapping his wings, wheeling round a bush, alighting, and, after a silent interval of listening, beginning to whir again. At each brushing of Clym's feet, white miller moths flew into the air just high enough to catch upon their dusty wings the mellowed light from the west, which now shone across the depressions and levels of the ground, without falling thereon to light them up. Yeobright walked on amid this quiet scene, with a hope that all would soon be well. 3 miles on, he came to a spot where a soft perfume was wafted across his path, and he stood still for a moment to inhale the familiar scent. It was the place at which 4 hours earlier his mother had sat down exhausted on the knoll covered with shepherd's thyme. While he stood, a sound between a breathing and a moan suddenly reached his ears. He looked to where the sound came from, but nothing appeared there save the verge of the hillock stretching against the sky in an unbroken line. He moved a few steps in that direction, and now he perceived a recumbent figure almost close at his feet. Among the different possibilities as to the person's individuality, there did not for a moment occur to Yeobright that it might be one of his own family. Sometimes furze-cutters had been known to sleep out of doors at these times, to save a long journey homeward and back again. But Clym remembered the moan, and looked closer, and saw that the form was feminine, and a distress came over him like cold air from a cave.
but he was not absolutely certain that the woman was his mother, till he stooped and beheld her face, pallid and with closed eyes. His breath went, as it were, out of his body, and the cry of anguish, which would have escaped him, died upon his lips. During the momentary interval that elapsed before he became conscious that something must be done, all sense of time and place left him, and it seemed as if he and his mother were as when he was a child with her many years ago on this heath, at hours similar to the present. Then he awoke to activity, and bending yet lower, he found that she still breathed, and that her breath, though feeble, was regular, except when disturbed by an occasional gasp. "Oh, what is it? Mother! Are you very ill? You're not dying?" he cried, pressing his lips to her face. "I am your Clem! How did you come here? What does it all mean?" At that moment the chasm in their lives, which his love for Eustacia had caused, was not remembered by Yeobright, and to him the present joined continuously with that friendly past that had been their experience before the division. She moved her lips, appeared to know him, but could not speak, and then Clem strove to consider how best to move her, as it would be necessary to get her away from the spot before the dews were intense. He was able-bodied, and his mother was thin. He clasped his arms round her, lifted her a little, and said, "Does that hurt you?" She shook her head, and he lifted her up. Then, at a slow pace, went onward with his load. The air was now completely cool, but whenever he passed over a sandy patch of ground uncarpeted with vegetation, there was reflected from its surface into his face the heat which it had imbibed during the day. At the beginning of his undertaking, he had thought but little of the distance which yet would have to be traversed before Bloom's End could be reached, but though he had slept that afternoon, he soon began to feel the weight of his burden. Thus he proceeded, like Aeneas with his father, the bats circling round his head, nightjars flapping their wings within a yard of his face, and not a human being within call. While he was yet nearly a mile from the house, his mother exhibited signs of restlessness under the constraint of being borne along, as if his arms were irksome to her. He lowered her upon his knees, and looked around. The point they had now reached, though far from any road, was not more than a mile from the Bloom's End cottages occupied by Fairway, Sam, Humphrey, and the Cantles. Moreover, 50 yards off stood a hut, built of clods and covered with thin turves, but now entirely disused. The simple outline of the lonely shed was visible, and thither he determined to direct his steps. As soon as he arrived, he laid her down carefully by the entrance, and then ran and cut with his pocket-knife an armful of the driest fern. Spreading this within the shed, which was entirely open on one side, he placed his mother thereon. Then he ran with all his might towards the dwelling of Fairway. Nearly a quarter of an hour had passed, disturbed only by the broken breathing of the sufferer, when moving figures began to animate the line between heath and sky. In a few moments Clem arrived, with Fairway, Humphrey, and Susan Nonsuch. Ollie Dowden, who had chanced to be at Fairway's, Christian and Grandfer Cantle following helter-skelter behind. They had brought a lantern and matches, water, a pillow, and a few other articles which had occurred to their minds in the hurry of the moment. Sam had been dispatched back again for brandy, and a boy brought Fairway's pony, upon which he rode off to the nearest medical man with directions to call at Wildeve's on his way and inform Thomasin that her aunt was unwell. Sam and the brandy soon arrived, and it was administered by the light of the lantern, after which she became sufficiently conscious to signify by signs that something was wrong with her foot. Ollie Dowden at length understood her meaning, and examined the foot indicated. It was swollen and red. Even as they watched, the red began to assume a more livid colour, in the midst of which appeared a scarlet speck, smaller than a pea, and it was found to consist of a drop of blood, which rose above the smooth flesh of her ankle in a hemisphere. "I know what it is," cried Sam. "She's been stung by an adder." "Yes," said Clem instantly. "I remember when I was a child seeing just such a bite. Oh, my poor mother!" "It was my father who was bit," said Sam, "and there's only one way to cure it. You must rub the place with the fat of other adders, and the only way to get that is by frying them. That's what they did for him." "'Tis an old remedy," said Clem distrustfully, "and I have doubts about it. But we can do nothing else till the doctor comes." "'Tis a sure cure," said Ollie Dowden with emphasis. "I've used it when I used to go out nursing." "Then we must pray for daylight to catch them," said Clem gloomily. "I see what I can do," said Sam. He took a green hazel which he had used as a walking-stick, split it at the end, inserted a small pebble, and with the lantern in his hand went out into the heath. Clem had by this time lit a small fire, and dispatched Susan Nonsuch for a frying-pan. Before she had returned, Sam came in with 3 adders, one briskly coiling and uncoiling in the cleft of the stick, and the other 2 hanging dead across it. "I've only been able to get one alive and fresh as he ought to be," said Sam. "These limp ones are 2 I killed today at work, but as they don't die till the sun goes down, they can't be very stale meat." The live adder regarded the assembled group with a sinister look in its small black eye, and the beautiful brown and jet pattern on its back seemed to intensify with indignation. Mrs. Yeobright saw the creature, and the creature saw her. She quivered throughout, and averted her eyes. "Oh, look at that!" murmured Christian Cantle. "Neighbours, how do we know but that something of the old serpent in God's garden, that give the apple to the young woman with no clothes, lives on in adders and snakes still? Look at his eye! For all the world like a villainous sort of black currant. 'Tis to be hoped he can't ill wish us. There's folks in Heath who've been overlooked already. I'll never kill another adder as long as I live." "Well, 'tis right to be afeard of things if folks can't help it," says Grandfer Cantle. "'Twould have saved me many a brave danger in my time."
"I fancy I heard something outside the shed," said Christian. "Oh, I wish troubles would come in the daytime, for then a man could show his courage, and hardly beg for mercy of the most broomstick old woman he should see, if he was a brave man and able to run out of her sight."
"Even such an ignorant feller as I should know better than do that," said Sam.
"Well, there's calamities where we least expect it, whether or no. Neighbours, if Mrs. Yeobright were to die, do you think we should be took up and tried for the manslaughter of a woman?"
"No, they couldn't bring it in as that," said Sam, "lest they could prove we'd been poachers at some time of our lives. But she'll fetch round. Now, if I'd been stung by 10 adders, I should hardly have lost a day's work for it," said Grandfer Cantle. "Such is my spirit when I'm on my mettle. But perhaps 'tis natural in a man trained for war. Yes, I've gone through a good deal,
but nothing ever came amiss to me after I joined the locals in 4.
He shook his head and smiled at a mental picture of himself in uniform.
Oh, I was always first in the most gallantest scrapes in my younger days.
I suppose that was because they always used to put the biggest fool afore, said Fairway from the fire, besides which he knelt, blowing it with his breath.
Do you think so, Timothy? Said Grandfer Cantle, coming forward to Fairway's side, with sudden depression in his face. Oh, then a man may feel for years that he is good solid company, and be wrong about himself after all. Never mind that question, Grandfer. Stir your stumps and get some more sticks. 'Tis very nonsense of an old man to prattle so, when life and death's in mangling.
Yes, yes, said Grandfer Cantle, with melancholy conviction.
Well, this is a bad night altogether for them that have done well in their time. And if I were ever such a dab at the hautboy or tenor viol, I shouldn't have the art to play tunes upon 'em now.
Susan now arrived with the frying pan, when the live adder was killed and the heads of the 3 taken off. The remainders, being cut into lengths and split open, were tossed into the pan, which began hissing and crackling over the fire. Soon a rill of clear oil trickled from the carcasses, whereupon Clem dipped the corner of his handkerchief into the liquid and anointed the wound. End of chapter 7.